What was unarguably the most talked about game from the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Chess Championship in Moscow 2019 might actually be one of the only games you remember from the event now more than 4 months ago. The Iranian Alireza Firouzja faced off against the Norwegian World Chess Champion Magnus Carlsen in what was a game that everyone was talking about, not just for the amazing chess that was on the board, but ultimately the appeal, as you see right here, that Alireza Firouzja made later on. We covered it in the news report. And maybe you haven't actually seen live what it was that Magnus Carlsen did at the board that had Alireza feeling justified in making this appeal. We're going to point that out to you, of course, when it happens on the board. As Magnus Carlsen usually does arrive a little bit late to his games, likes to keep his opponents in suspense, Alireza gets buckled up to do his thing, along with, I believe, Yu Yongyi there in the background versus Vladimir Kramnik, and then Vladislav Artemiev facing off against Jan-Krzysztof Duda. But with Magnus Carlsen coming to the board and the nerves now building for all of us, along with the young Firouzja, we see them shake hands. Magnus comes to the side and signs in for yet another day's work, as he often does, just doing his thing as the World Chess Champion, a day that ultimately crowned him the World Blitz Champion. But as Magnus takes a seat, we've got a few more seconds. I'm going to preview for you what we're going to talk about as far as the chess moments in the couple extra minutes we have afterwards. Our cameraman on site did such an amazing job getting us extra footage when the controversy started to be discussed. But the moves I'm going to highlight for you that we won't have as much time to do in real fashion are Magnus Carlsen's interesting novelty idea, bishop h6 instead of the previous a5 from Fabiano Caruana. We're going to talk about Alireza's enterprising response to that. And at some point, we're going to jump ahead and show that perhaps if Firouzja had played instead queen c1, but the move 19 bishop takes e6, he might have actually been winning and we may never have had any controversy. Of course, that could also be said for the fact that Magnus Carlsen, instead of playing knight takes e3, keeping the bishop pair, could have played bishop takes e3 and also gone on to win. I'm going to show you all of those moments and more, and I'm going to highlight the fact that I think when Magnus played the move king takes b5, he already smelt potential blood in the water and thought he might have a chance to flag his young opponent. So all of that is to come in this video, but for now, we jump out to a Ruy Lopez mainline variation, nothing fancy to it. The move d6 played gives Firouzja a little bit of a pause, but not much. Of course, it is still pretty common theory. White castles, black plays bishop to d7, and after c3 we get g6. This is the move that really defines this kind of closed structure. Black's taking the extra time to get developed, and it's a little bit slow, but ultimately, strategically, perhaps he was hoping to outmaneuver his young opponent in the middle game. Firouzja has already played the move h3, and after knight f6, brings the bishop back to c2. Both sides know what they're doing at this point, so nothing too serious to talk about. Castles and rook to e1. Magnus Carlsen goes for his vintage, grab a piece and twiddle it while I'm pretending that I don't know what to do here. Of course, I know the theory. I'm going to play the move rook to e8. And Firouzja going to give pause before thinking about his very natural Ruy Lopez approach. Of course, the knight coming to d2 ultimately has plans to go as well to f1 and g3, as you do in many Spanish games. Queen to e7, played by Magnus Carlsen. Not necessarily played with the intention of actually opening up the files in these particular structures, because the rook on e1 will win the battery battle, as Firouzja has already played knight f1. But now we see queen f8, the intention of Magnus Carlsen's plan. As I said, queen e7 was not played to open the file, but to go for a novelty idea where the bishop was going to come to h6 and try to trade itself off for the white dark square bishop. This is an idea that hasn't really been tried before, and as I said quickly in the preview, the move a5 was played by Fabiano Caruana in a big event on our own server, actually, Chess.com. But Carlsen plays the move bishop h6. He wants to get the dark square bishops off the board. Positionally, it makes a lot of sense. Because this structure often remains closed, that bishop can be a very dubious piece. So this interesting idea, unfortunately for Carlsen, is not met with favor. Firouzja said, you know what, I agree with you. Getting rid of that bishop will be an improvement for you given the dark square closed structure. So I'm going to put my knight on g5 and deny you that opportunity. This is the first moment in the game that really gives either player a true think. Here we see Magnus grab the piece to fiddle that I think this time actually does have him trying to go into his thought process of how do I want to approach this surprising move. The move on knight to g5 not only denies the dark square bishop trade, but also opens up queen to f3 to hit a now undefended piece. This is a key point to highlight now because I'm going to come back to it later on. It may indeed have been the key tactic that Firouzja himself underestimated as a potential opportunity in his position. But Carlsen is stuck because the whole maneuver of queen f8, bishop h6 was designed for this trade to happen, and with that not being an option, it's unclear whether those pieces are ideally placed. Natural moves like bringing the rooks over in these positions can be very dangerous to the coming threats. Because of that, Carlsen, as you saw, just played the move knight to d8, an exclamation point move given by Grandmaster Dejan Boykov over in the Chess.com news report, because it overprotects f7 and is already meeting, if you will, the move bishop b3 with an okay defensive setup. However, after the move knight to e6, blocking the attack of the f7 pawn and offering more trades over here, trying to force his diagonal open, is Magnus. Firouzja is still stubborn, doesn't want to trade dark square bishops. Plays h4 to reinforce his knight on g5 rather than settle on a trade or a retreating move that will give Magnus his goal. Rook to d8 now played. As I said, the natural maneuvers make a little more sense with the pieces in play. Bishop to e3 to reinforce the center. The move bishop to g7. Carlsen finally realizes he no longer has any real chances probably of getting this knight to blink, so why keep the bishop staring there? Note that trading would never be something in the favor, because where does this knight go? If it comes to h5, we simply trade and win a pawn. And of course, trading with the knight would have only allowed a fork of these two pieces. So, just to point out the obvious and why bishop g7 was played, and why after h5, Firouzja was already kind of feeling the love of his position. Carlsen brings the bishop back to h6, and this is the moment, as I highlighted earlier, where Firouzja could have struck gold. Instead of the move queen to c1, which he's about to play, the move bishop takes e6 was a brilliant one. After bishop takes queen f3, black's pieces are actually overloaded. If you defend the knight with the queen, I take here, and your bishop has been left behind by the queen. If you move the knight to safety, I trap your bishop. If you take, obviously this has devastating consequences in terms of opening the black king, which makes me realize that probably if the capture was made, black would have had to have taken with the pawn, and after d takes, and just about any queen move to get her off of the file, black is positionally in a terrible spot with these horrible, apparently I'm tongue-twisted, doubled e-pawns. So, I was surprised that a lot of people didn't point that out, and instead, after queen to c1, it was thought that, well, maybe this is the right approach from Firouzja, but indeed, bishop takes e6, having analyzed it with the engine, was a chance for a win. After the move knight to g4 was played, we've already seen the trade on e6 occur, and f takes e6, Firouzja going into a bit of a think before playing rook f1. Now, if I'm highlighting that Firouzja could have avoided the later controversy if he had found bishop takes e6, it's only fair to also highlight that Magnus Carlsen could have avoided the controversy if he hadn't played the move knight takes e3, which was bad. Bishop takes e3, I'm going to analyze real quick, because after f takes queen h6, a brilliant inchworm, queen to g5, followed by queen h4, would have actually led to a devastating attack against Firouzja, and I think the world champion would have made quick work of his young 16-year-old opponent. Unfortunately for Magnus, he actually was too biased to the bishop pair here and wanted to keep that bishop on the board, so as we've already seen, he traded with the knight, and after the move queen to e7, and the trade on g6, which has already occurred, we are now caught up to the live position, where queen to d2 was met with e takes d4. C takes d4 is played, and it's understandable why Magnus might have preferred this position. He does have the bishop here. You're looking at dark square pressure and a potentially weak king on the dark squares, and regardless of the fact that those who know the game well, you might already know that Firouzja was eventually the one pushing for a win, Carlsen is better here, and king g7, unfortunately, the slow approach misses his chance to press. Queen g5 with the double attack on the dark squares, followed by bringing every piece to be traded on the f-file, actually would have greatly overwhelmed white, and might have actually been another chance for Carlsen to be the clear victor instead of the controversial victor that we saw later on. But we continue here with trades in rook f8, before queen to c3 found by Firouzja, which is a bit of a shot there in the dark. You can see Magnus's kind of head nod, often something he says, body language, usually something he wears on his chest, and the piece fiddled there. I don't think he saw this idea, and I think he gets a little bit frustrated by the fact that it's clearly a double attack against the king and the pawn on c7. He settles on c6, which makes sense, and at this point I think black was still the one potentially a little bit better. But after the move about to be played by Firouzja, which is knight f1, I think here is where Carlsen overestimates the potential pressure of the queen when he settles on the move e5 you're about to see. One of the main points is that white is never really threatening to open this up. When doing so would actually eventually open up dark squares for this bishop, and I think would lead to a position that's better for black. So e5, as the computers suggest, was actually a small mistake, and it's exactly the blunder that after the trade and the move queen to c4 you're about to see that led to these light square problems. Suddenly Jay-Z's got 99 of them and Magnus is in trouble. So whether e5 was a horrible blunder or really it's just this move queen f6 instead of queen g7, as Dejan Boykov correctly analyzed, the bottom line is either way he's suddenly in huge trouble here after the move queen b4 check. We see Carlsen get frustrated before playing c5 with the loud sort of clock slam. We are moments away from what ultimately was the controversial moment. After the check here and the queen captures the pawn, it was this moment right here and the words whispered by Magnus that ultimately led to the controversy and the challenge that we foreshadowed in the beginning of the video. More on that later. The queen trade, and we see all the blunders have led to an endgame where only white can be winning. Carlsen correctly transitions into an opposite code bishop affair where you often have your best drawing chances. But the moves here are now going to come pretty fast and furious, so I'm going to do my best to keep up, providing little bits of insights as I can. Stick around because all the things we've already touched on that we didn't get to, I promise to deliver with analysis on those moments when this game concludes. What we do see here, though, is pretty good technique from the youngster. He balances both sides of the board. Even the move king f2 that ultimately comes back this way shows that he's trying to create threats of passed pawns and king entry everywhere. The king comes up, we play g4, that pawn being knocked over might be a little bit of a foreshadowing of something to come, both in terms of the fact that it was knocked over and the politeness in which Firouzja showed to reset the pawn up before hitting the clock. Again, more on that later. King to g6 shows that Carlsen is in big trouble. The b pawn combined with the king targeting things over here ultimately leads to some bad news. And again, here we see the pawn being slipped from what I believe was a very nervous Firouzja's hands, understandably so. But right here, right now, the move bishop d2, pointed out as a blunder by some, I think was actually Carlsen really calling the kid's bluff. Firouzja needed to find king f7. Again, I'm going to show that later. Instead, he doesn't, and takes the bait that the pawn was actually attacked. But now in the time scramble, we're going to see that Carlsen blockading the dark squares ends up confusing the youngster just enough where you wouldn't call it now that he's about to lose on time, but if you look at the body language of the players and how much more time, just a second extra that he's taking on every move is really going to, oh, and there it is. It's leading to the nerves that comes out, and after king g4, we see the drama is real, the table is slammed, and the arbiter has set up the pieces, wait for it, in a draw according to the DGT board, and we see Magnus Carlsen is actually not happy about that. Now, as we see them debating this, I'm going to provide a little bit of insight into what you see on the board, the kings being put on these two squares, and why the controversial debates already started getting crazy. The kings being there represents a draw to the DGT board. That's what the arbiter was claiming. Magnus knows his rules, and his immediate sort of frustration with that ruling, we can see, is what led me to believe that he already knew he had a chance to flag Alireza as far back as perhaps this move. I'm going to show it right now, the move king takes b5, rather than trying to maybe sit tight on the blockade. I think he knew that with some tough questions, the kid might use more time than he should have. The next few moves, yes, you could argue that bishop to c3 is the best blockading move, but white is still winning with best play. So I actually think this move bishop to d2, again, calling the kid's bluff, making him think his pawn is hanging when actually, after bishop d2, the move king f7 would be winning on the spot, sacrificing the bishop and going into a winning king and pawn ending. And again, a lot of this is speculation. I admit I've now watched this 17-minute video probably many more times than I should have, given that, you know, I'm supposed to be getting paid to do other things. But hey, you know what? We're here. And I actually think that Carlsen knew very well that if this game led to a loss on time for Firouzja, that he wins in that call. Just because there's opposite code bishops on the board and no other mating material does not mean that according to the FIDE bylaws, black isn't winning. In fact, he's right. What you'll find out later on in the news report, or what you did find out later on in the news report, was that the FIDE ruling says as long as there's in theory a possible checkmate, then the game can be deemed a win despite not having what is considered theoretical mating material. So, in the end, with much time, we see Firouzja is getting that explained to him right now. He actually he actually did make the right call, meaning the arbiter, as I'm saying, with more time. Eventually makes the right call. Firouzja kind of laughs it off now, but later we know he was super frustrated. Now, what exactly was the chess moment that deeply frustrated Firouzja? That moment we saw earlier at about the 10-minute and 31-second mark, where Magnus Carlsen, I don't think, was whispering sweet nothings to Firouzja in terms of his frustration with the position, but actually maybe letting his feelings show about what he knew was happening. After the move Queen f6 was played, and as I highlighted, e5 was really maybe the blunderous start to that plan. It was this combination that picks up the b7 pawn and ultimately the c5 pawn, this moment, that had Magnus very frustrated and saying whatever it was he did. That was later, of course, appealed to and overruled as if it is the case that your opponent is distracting you, which is what Firouzja tried to claim. He should have made that claim in the moment. How the arbiters would have ruled, no one really knows. People almost never make claims in the moment despite their opponent cursing under their breath, because frankly, Magnus Carlsen's a competitor and he was frustrated, and it's understandable that he may have been a little bit upset. Whether it's right to say something and say it out loud is another case, but either way, if you're frustrated about something your opponent is doing, you have to claim it in the moment, which of course Firouzja did not. Now, what I was saying about what I think Magnus Carlsen did back here, rather than settling on the passive blockade, but starting to sense his young opponent's nerves, playing the aggressive king takes b5, and then the aggressive maneuver of the bishop to d2. Again, looking at it, knowing that there was an opportunity to get your opponent to try to overthink it, I think Carlsen did just that, capitalized on the fact that Firouzja was unable to find king f7 with no time on his clock, and knew what he was doing to get the victory. Now, I want to show you some of the actual chess here, as a lot was being debated. In this particular position, with about a minute to go here, in this particular position, I want to show that Firouzja's best chance at a win was actually right here, instead of the move king to g4, but with the move g6. The point is the threat of g7 would force bishop to e5, and now king h6, followed by a sacrifice of the e-pawn, would have actually led to a win. What's funny to know is that the final position is actually a draw now if Carlsen has the right technique. The reason is that if you ever play g6 now, the bishop can come back to h6 and hold all the dark squares, and there's no way in. And if you try to bring the king in, the point is that the bishop can actually, I'm going to show it this way, if you try to bring the king in, either way, king f5 or king h5, the bishop can go to the diagonal just in time, and if you ever push, the bishop goes here, and if you ever try to lead with the king, the bishop goes back to d2. So, in the final position, Magnus Carlsen had actually held a draw, or depending on how you want to see it, Alireza Firouzja had missed a win. But regardless of that, the position has claimed a win for Magnus Carlsen because of the loss on time. Now again, that all happened because of Firouzja doing the right thing. I want to point that out. Whenever you make a move that knocks down a piece, you should set it up before you hit the clock. However, as many players who played over-the-board blitz will attest to, that's not always the thing that's done. Many times people make moves, they knock pieces over, and then they set them up on their opponent's clock. Highlighting that Firouzja did the right thing and that setting up this king before hitting the clock lost him the game only makes this defeat that much more of a nightmare, I guess you will, for Firouzja, and perhaps that much more of a reason why he will remember this battle in future blitz affairs versus Magnus Carlsen. So hope you enjoyed this video. Again, we tried to highlight all the different crazy critical chess that happened, as well as the controversy. Give us a like, give us a share, and let us know if we brought you any new insights into a game that surely you had already seen, but now maybe you have a little bit more knowledge of what exactly was the moment that led to the controversial appeal from Firouzja, as well as what the chess was telling us on the board throughout that time scramble. So thanks for tuning in, and more from the Chess.com Blitz archives coming your way soon. You can click on either of the videos in front of you if you're really into these types of videos, and we'll see you around on Chess.com.